In September of 1967, I started the fourth grade in my fifth school. Once again, I was the new kid with an odd name, dorky clothes chosen big enough to grow into, and the frustration of being back on square one with no friends. After a string of moves due to my father's quest for tenure and country living, we went from Southern California to New England, leaving behind suburban neighborhoods and overcrowded classrooms to settle in rural Heinsberg, Vermont. Population 1,217 after my family's arrival. Every day after school, I boarded the number 2 bus for an hour-long circuitous ride through the entire town, finally getting dropped off at my stop. From there, I would begin my walk home, traipsing a mile down a narrow dirt road called Sherman Hollow. For the first few afternoons, I walked alone, bored and feeling banished to the wilderness. That was until one day, about a quarter of the way home, Cubby showed up. Half Springer Spaniel, half everything else, he greeted me with his spastic wagging and pet-me-now friendliness. He sported that ever-present wet dog smell, which included pond mud, something dead he had recently rolled in, and hints of his last skunk and tomato juice encounter. Cubby loved any variation of fetch, and that fall, we pursued our NFL careers. I would elude the imaginary rush and send Cubby deep, throwing the stick as hard and as high as I could. He'd run a dazzling post pattern with some great jukes to toast the invisible cornerbacks, catching the stick on one hop because, dog rules. Instantly, he would switch roles and turn into the free safety who had just picked me off, running back at me at full speed, ears laid back, his near-toxic slobber streaming from the stick, clenched in his mouth, kicking up leaves with evasive moves, avoiding my desperate attempts to push him out of bounds. This was an all-pro dog. Occasionally, he'd call a timeout, dashing off the road into the trees to chase some unidentified scurrying creature, reassuring his fans that above all, he was still a dedicated backwoods hunting dog. It was never a good idea to get too low while petting Cubby because he was a wanton face licker. But Cubby was my first Heinsberg friend, and the walk home from the bus stop became a favorite ritual for us both. Cubby took it upon himself to help a kid transition from friend-filled suburbia to rural solitude. He kept an eye on me. A couple weeks after meeting Cubby, I met his owner, Slim, who lived in a cabin a few hundred feet off the road about 2/3 of the way home. He wore a trooper-style hat with ear flaps dangling down and a red plaid hunting jacket. He held a rifle in one hand and in the other a jug of water that he would regularly fill from the neighbor's hose to top off his cistern. His muddy sorrel boots groaned out footsteps in the wet gravel as he walked towards me. He said hello and asked if I was one of those kids from that city family that built the new house up across the road. I said I was. "So what's your name?" "Eber," I said. Even by age 9, when I told people my name, I was already used to people saying, "What? What is it?" I usually had to repeat it a couple times and spell it, but not Slim. He just nodded. But he did end up calling me Hebrew for the entire time I knew him. And I really didn't care, because it was better than the teasing and nicknames I got from kids at school. "Well, I'm Slim." His face contorted as he spoke sideways, a lone brown incisor standing like a fence post propped up his lower lip. I'm sure he had a last name, but I never knew it. And he turned and trudged up the wide path that he insisted on calling his driveway. "Come on, Cubby." And that's when I found out Cubby's name. He was no longer Willie Brown. Whenever age came up, Slim was 79 for the few years that I knew him. He spent his mornings hunting and his evenings drinking, and sometimes vice versa, which is why Cubby was free to roam in the afternoons. He would have stood 6'4" if not permanently hunched over a concave chest with baggy dickies cinched above his navel. He lived off the land surrounding his 4-acre lot, picking fiddlehead ferns and dandelions in the spring, growing squash, tomatoes, chard in a weedy garden through the summer. Slim would also shoot and eat just about anything. Possums, gray squirrels, rabbits, even the occasional snapping turtle from the large beaver pond. Of course, he hunted duck and pheasant and deer when they were in season, and sometimes when they weren't. He claimed to only bag the limit, but always had a suspicious gleam in his eye when asked, "Who are you, the goddamn game warden?" The only car that ever used Slim's driveway was his nephew's. Junior drove his Bondo and primer splotched Impala out from Winooski once a month, and he brought staples like coffee, flour, canned goods, tobacco, and half-gallon bottles of Old Crow Canadian whiskey. At the end of the driveway stood Slim's single-room tall tar paper tin roof cabin with Salvation Army furniture, a pair of pull-string light bulbs, and filled with a lively aromatic blend of wood stove embers, fried meat, body odor, and mildew. And sometimes on weekends I would wander over in the afternoons to see what he was up to if he was around. I think he enjoyed the company. Slim had been in the Army in World War I. I found this out one day when I discovered a faded sepia photograph on the cabin wall of a young version of him and some other guys in knickered uniforms with nebula-shaped helmets and bolt-action rifles. He said he fought in France, where his voice turned into a bucksaw baritone by mustard gas fumes and the decades of bronchitis and cigarettes that followed. "You ever eat muskrat? Go on, try some. It's better than squirrel." He sat there pinching a wad of Samson mild tobacco into a rolling paper, ready to chuckle at my city boy response. But I just kept wandering around the cabin, taking in the decor. Slim thought of himself as a self-taught craftsman, and taxidermy was his art of choice. He had dozens of antlers, some with heads, mounted on planks on the walls inside and outside his cabin. He had a smelly bearskin rug made from an actual black bear, the ears and half of the face still intact, although Cubby had done a number on one of the ears. But Slim's masterpiece was Gus, a stuffed raccoon on the corner shelf, posed standing on his hind legs, mouth open, front legs raised in attack. The body was okay, maybe a little malformed, but the head was definitely Picasso-esque, since he bagged him with a shot behind the ear. One eye was the shriveled, preserved original per the instructions, the other replaced with a marble. Grotesque and also a bit smelly, it was by far the scariest but coolest thing in the cabin. On the other side of the room was a dresser, the top of which was covered with various trinkets and keepsakes. When I picked up a framed photo of a young woman in a long dress, Slim's stubbled cheeks flattened out and his eyes hunkered down behind a squint. An uncomfortable pause inflated between us when I asked him who she was. He ran his tongue slowly down the glue edge of the cigarette paper, finished rolling, and jabbed the crooked smoke into the side of his crooked mouth. "That's Sarah." He lit a kitchen match on his thigh, and the cigarette flared up when he put the flame to it. He stared at me for a few seconds, and a slug of annoyance ricocheted off a small outcropping of sadness. Could be Sarah fell for some guy, moved to Plattsburgh, raised a family, buried 2 husbands, and now lives alone. Or maybe she died of tuberculosis back in 23 when they were courting. Or even more likely, they actually did get married, and she left him because he came home drunk and beat her up one too many times. But whatever he or Sarah did, she broke his heart a long time ago, and ever since. And there was not enough bourbon between here and Moncton Ridge that would get him to talk about her. Instead, he grabbed the .30-06 off the gun rack that he had made from deer feet and pushed me out the door to go shoot cans and bottles. "Come on, kid. I'm going to teach you how to shoot the big gun." Over the next year, Slim taught me how to handle the kick of a 12-gauge shotgun, explained to me how to lead a pheasant with a blast of buckshot. He taught me the fine art of aiming with bladed post sights, scoffing that scopes were for the goddamn new yackers and massholes. The ones that invaded the back roads of Vermont every deer season. With my reluctance hiding from his derision, he instructed me through the gutting and skinning of a deer and just about every small and apparently edible rodent native to Vermont. But Slim was a mean drunk. When he was lit, Cubby would keep a safe distance, and so would I. He would argue loudly with himself, sputtering curse words and hollow threats at invisible sons of bitches as he walked through the woods. And if you ever saw him like this, you would have had a tough time guessing exactly what year he was wandering around in. And over the course of several months, it got progressively worse until it seemed like he was just drunk all the time. I started going over less frequently, by now spending more time on weekends helping out at the neighbor's farm or riding my bike a few miles to the houses of my friends from school. But I went over for a visit one Sunday, and he came out of the cabin pissed off and acted crazy. He raised his arms, his rifle in hand, and yelled at me to get the fuck out of here. And that if I ever came back, he'd shoot me and my whole goddamn family. So I took off and ran home. He scared the shit out of me. I told my parents that night, but they assured me that Slim was just a harmless old drunk, but that I probably shouldn't go over there anymore. No one could ever accuse my parents of being overprotective. But they did let me sleep on the floor of their room that night, and of course I woke up every time some animal rustled in the woods outside. Cubby and I stayed friends. On weekends, when I rode my bike to my friend's house, he would follow me for a while, but just to the top of Palmer's Hill, where he would stop and watch to make sure I sped down through the loose gravel and potholes in one piece. He was still keeping an eye on me. And he'd still meet me on the walks home from the school bus stop so we could play through the '69 World Series, football season, the winter months, mud season, and then returning to baseball in the late spring. Baseball was his absolute favorite. But if I saw Slim on the road, I would duck into the trees and hide until he was out of sight. The summer of 1970, I spent at my grandparents' in California, and when I came home, I found out Slim had died, and that Junior had come out and picked up most of his stuff and took it all back to Winooski. This would have included Cubby, and it meant that Cubby must have ended up fenced in a small backyard. The worst possible fate that could befall a dog who is free to explore the woods every day. They probably should have just shot him instead. All those afternoons we spent together on the road living our imagined sports greatness became a single memory, one that still runs up to me every once in a while, greeting me with a panting face and full body wag, a memory that I can pat on the head and smile at. An art professor from the university bought Slim's lot, tore down the cabin, and started building a house. I wandered over there one day to find a 30-foot dumpster filled with the shards of Slim's cabin and what appeared to be its remaining contents. And there, sitting prominently on top, was Gus, that ugly stuffed raccoon. I moved away and went to college in the fall of 1976. My parents sold the property and moved to Burlington a few years after that. Nobody hunts that area much anymore. The properties on both sides of that section of Sherman Hollow Road have been posted for decades. Nowadays, it's just lined with custom country homes every few hundred yards. I haven't held a rifle in 50 years, and even after a few dogs of my own, I have never met a dog that came close to Cubby's stellar athleticism. But I do remember the taste of fried muskrat. And it's definitely not better than squirrel.
Eber Lambert, ladies and gentlemen. Eber Lambert.